today revolving around Martin Luther, and we are pleased to have a guest speaker here. I don't know if I should call you professor or
retired or
AU.
Yes.
Thank you for being here today. We look forward to your presentation.
I don't know how many of you have been here for all four parts, but if you're here for the fourth part, you are very, very tired by this particular time. The thing that I'm going to ask you is, I've got material prepared, but I think it's far more important that we deal with questions that you might have. Perhaps you've seen the Luther movie. Maybe there's some questions that were generated by that. Maybe there are some things that you've read which have generated questions. Perhaps some of the material we'll be looking at this afternoon will generate questions, but please do not wait for me to stop. Okay, I can assure you that I can talk longer than any of you can listen. When I taught the Reformation at the seminary, I usually got something around 50 hours of time, and so we don't have near that amount of time this afternoon. So I've sort of chosen some things, and they may not be exactly the kinds of things that you have in mind. So by all means, ask. Just stop me. You won't be messing me up at all, and we'll try and deal with the questions that you have as we go along. One of the things that I'd like to start out with is by pointing out, as I look at the Reformation, I see the hand of the Lord in action in oh so many ways. You're familiar with the Bible passage from Galatians chapter 4. That particular passage has reference to the coming of the Savior. And Paul is reminding us that the Lord orchestrated things in such a way that when Jesus came into the world, the situation was just right so that the gospel message could be spread and spread quickly. You think of something called the Roman peace, the Pax Romana. You think of a universal language that they had at the time in Greek. You think of the relative ease of transportation with the Roman road system. All of those things were brought together by the Lord so that the good news could be spread as rapidly and as far as possible in a relatively short period of time. As I look at the Reformation, I see the same kind of thing happening. That the Lord is making it possible not only for the Reformation to take place, but for the Reformation message to be spread very, very quickly. Perhaps Professor Deutschlander early this morning touched on some of those things. I think in particular about the political situation. If Luther had been born 100 years earlier, he probably would have ended up like Jan Hus, burned at the stake. I think of the economy, where after centuries of decline, now things are improving, and it's going to make it possible for Luther's father to have the kind of money in his pocket to send his son away to school. I think of the social situation, where people are becoming, shall we say, disenchanted with the status quo and are interested in a change. And I think of technology and how the Lord has provided the printing press as a way to get the message out. Martin Luther's not the first guy to know about justification by faith alone. And yet so many in the hundreds of years before Luther who knew about justification by faith alone weren't able to get the message out. And if they wrote something down, it languished in some monastic library someplace. Luther is going to be a wizard at getting the information out by using the new technology that is available. The printing press in the 16th century, I would suggest, is the equivalent of internet here in the 21st century as far as the ease of getting information out. So when the Lord in his mercy thought that the time was right to bring about Reformation, he has all of these pieces in place, and he prepares a servant, a messenger, to sort of spearhead. Martin Luther, I think, if he were here with us today, would be a little bit unhappy. Unhappy with all of the emphasis that is being placed on him. Because he's going to insist that he really did nothing. That God did everything, which of course is exactly true. You have a handout which has just a brief chronology of Luther's life, and from time to time I'll be pointing out things on there, but obviously we won't have time to hit everything that's on that particular sheet. Martin Luther's parents were in many ways common German stock. Luther liked to say that his forefathers were rechte Bauern, that they were real, genuine farmers. They weren't peasants, however, in the way that we normally think of peasants who are tied to the land. They were not serfs. Luther's forefathers were independent of the local authorities. They were part of a special group called the Erbsensleute, a group of people who were not tied to the land, who did not owe tax on their person, but simply owed tax on the property that they had. They had a great deal of freedom, which many of the peasants did not have in the 15th and 16th century. But there is a problem. Luther's father, Hans, is the eldest son. And in this particular group that Luther's forefathers came from, the eldest son could not inherit the family farm. In fact, it was just the reverse. Rather than primogeniture, rather than the first son, it was ultimogeniture. It was the youngest son who would inherit the farm. That meant, of course, that Ma and Pa could be in charge of the farm for a little bit longer, and then when they got older, the youngest boy would provide for them. But Hans here, he's the eldest son. So he can't inherit the family farm unless he's an only son, which is not the case here. There are 4 sons in this particular family. Hans has 3 brothers, so not too likely that he'll inherit the farm. He could marry a farm. In other words, if some farmer has only a daughter, he could marry the daughter and thereby also marry the farm. Or he could work as a laborer on a farm, or he could find a position someplace else. Well, because of the changing economy at this particular time, there is an up-and-coming industry that is going to provide opportunity for people who otherwise might not have had many opportunities. And that's the mining industry. Luther's father, Hans, is going to be involved, especially as a copper miner. So he's going to be moving off of the family farm. You notice he lives to a ripe old age. When you consider that 50% of babies born did not make it to age 5, there's a high infant mortality rate. Somebody who would have made it to 70 would have been considered very, very old at this time. Now, today we know, of course, anybody approaching 70 is just hitting the prime of life and not at all at the end of things. That, by the way, is a Lucas Cranach portrait. Lucas Cranach, who does many of the Reformation personages, he does that obviously towards the end of Hans's life. Luther's mother, Margareta, Luther says that his father married above his station. In other words, he did not marry a farm girl. Margareta comes from Eisenach. Her family is quite well-to-do. The Lindemans there in Eisenach, some of them were lawyers, some of them were high officials in the church. So when Luther says his father married above his station in life, he wasn't kidding. Luther describes her as a virtuous woman, a woman who loved music, and I can't help but think that her love for music was passed on to her son Martin. Both Margareta and Hans were common as far as their religious ideas were concerned. There was a great deal of superstition that was involved in religion at this particular time. For example, if somebody became ill, you'd look around and see if there was somebody who maybe had given you the evil eye, as if that was the cause of illness. They saw spirits, both good and bad, in springs and in wells and in trees. A lot of elements of paganism from a bygone era were still prevalent in the Catholic Church as we enter into the 16th century. Now you notice we do not know when Margareta was born. We do know that she died the year after her husband Hans did. And she looks like maybe more of a common peasant woman in this particular picture that Lucas Cranach did. But again, that was common attire for this particular time. You did not wash your hair every day or every week or maybe every month. And so it's maybe a good idea to keep it somewhat covered. And oftentimes you'll see the women with their heads covered in these pictures from this particular era. Mura, you see it circled there, south of Eisenach. That is the farming village from which Hans Luther and his forefathers are going to come. So that is a place that Luther himself would visit from time to time when he was in the area to see some of his relatives. Early on, after they get married, Hans and Margareta are going to go to the land of opportunity, the area in which the mining industry was becoming more prevalent and popular. And so they are first going to reside in the city of Eisleben. This is the place where Martin is going to be born. And very quickly after Martin Luther is born, they are going to move a little farther into the Harz Mountains. Again, more opportunities available there, less competition, and Mansfeld is going to be the place that Luther, if you would have asked him where is home, that's what he would have said. Mansfeld is the place where he is going to grow up. If you go to Eisleben, they will show you this house and they will insist that this is where Luther was born. On the second floor of this house, rented facilities that Hans and Margareta had. And on the evening of November 10th, little Martin is going to be born. Now, remember what I said about infant mortality rate. Very, very high infant mortality rate. And so you can tell that the parents are concerned about their child because very, very quickly they are going to have the child baptized. And if you go up the street and around the corner, you'll come to the Church of St. Peter and Paul. And that's where Martin is going to be baptized on the next day, the 11th of November. Every day had at least one, if not multiple, saints attached to it. And the 11th of November happens to be the day, the festival of Saint Martin of Tours. Saint Martin of Tours was from the 4th century, so a long time before. And the little baby is going to be named after the patron saint of the day. So he's named Martin not because his grandpa's name is that or uncle's name is that, but because this is the name of the saint of the day. I've often thought it rather unfortunate that it should be St. Martin's Day, because St. Martin is the patron saint of reformed drunks. And as a result of that, sometimes Catholic historians who did not really like Martin Luther would make reference to that fact, that he sort of was in need of what that particular saint had. Pastor Shady.
In medieval times, Martinmas was also very, very important. Not as necessarily a church festival, but as
Fall festival or whatever you want.
well, okay. I mean, I suppose the harvest festival, all things were finished. So that probably would be maybe another good reason for it, rather than that they were so religious that they didn't have to say.
Luther himself says of his mother that she was religious. His father, he doesn't really make a great deal of comment about that, other than the fact that his father could be a rather hard man. But both of them went to church. That was expected at this particular time, that you would be going to church. And of course, Hans is going to teach his son a few things about religion, like when you get yourself into trouble, you need to call on the patron saint of miners. Miners had a special saint, and that would be St. Anne.
The other thing was that on the Martinmas, that was also the time when spirits came back, didn't it? I mean, so it would have been a wonderful, almost necessity that you get your...
All Saints Eve. All Saints Eve. That's Holy Eve. You got to go back a couple days. November 1st is All Saints Day, and All Saints Day, October 31st, was Holy Eve, Halloween, already at that time. But you're right, then the saints, or the spirits rather, of the dead, and also then of your dead relatives. You want to recognize them on that date as well.
I want to know my child back life when that happened.
Please?
Is there a sense of membership to the churches? Was this their church that they were right up the road from, so they could...
By geography. Anybody within a given precinct was automatically a member because there was no other church to belong to, at least no legal church to belong to. If you were out in Bohemia, of course, you could be a Hussite, but they were trying to get rid of them, kind of thing. So this is a rather small town. So as far as in town goes, this would be the major church there. But if you go to a bigger town, there might be multiple churches, and depending upon where you were located, it was expected that you would go to the nearest one. Unless you had some special reason for maybe going to the cathedral, or that would be a little bit different. You had your parish church, and the cathedral, of course, was the church for the entire diocese. So Mansfeld, Luther is not yet a year old, maybe only a few months old when the family moves to Mansfeld. I feel even less certain that this is the house that Luther grew up in, but again, they will tell you that this is where he grew up, and that perhaps the foundation of the building was there at Luther's time. But other than that, a little bit difficult to say. Luther's father started out as a laborer in the mines. but this guy has a spirit of entrepreneurship. He's a guy who works hard, and he is going to very quickly lease a mine and a smelter to go along with it. And over time, he's going to increase the size of his holdings. I say lease because technically all the mines were owned by the Counts of Mansfeld. And so you would get a long lease on the property that you could work. But technically it was the Count who owned the land. By 1501, Hans is going to own, lease, however you want to say it, 6 of these mine shafts and 2 smelters. So I mean, in a relatively short period of time, he has really elevated himself. You can see that because he's going to be elected to the town council. And the only people who were elected to the town council were people who could provide something for the community. Not every Tom, Dick, or Harry could be on the town council. You also see that when Luther goes to the university. Luther is listed as inhabendo. He's from a family that we would say is a member of the haves. They have the financial ability to pay for his university fees. So again, you see that he works his way up very, very rapidly. Luther's father wants his son to have a good education. And from early on, it's clear that Luther's father doesn't want his son in the mines, but rather wants his son to have a university education and ultimately to become a lawyer. And of course, that's going to take a great deal of training. It's going to take a certain amount of financial backing in order to make that possible. My father meant it heartily by me, was Luther's way of putting it. That his father was very determined that his son would have a good education. And fortunately, Mansfeld has the first of the steps. If you were ultimately going to go to the university, you had to know Latin. And Mansfeld had a Latin school. Now, Luther doesn't think very highly of it. When he refers to it as a hellhole, that was not a term of endearment. Luther said that Latin was not so much learned as it was beaten into you, which is probably helping you to understand why he said the previous thing. But his first 8 years of education were there in Mansfeld. Now, going to the university was not dependent upon how old you were or having X number of years of schooling. You could go to the university when you could demonstrate that you could handle the material. And it was often the case that students would go to a number of schools before they went to the university. And what you do is you get the benefit of the best that each school has to offer. And so Luther's father, in his attempt to get his son into the university, is not going to be satisfied with just little Mansfeld's Latin school, but is going to want to send him to other schools in preparation to get into the university. And so he sends him to the cathedral school in Magdeburg, much, much bigger town. The cathedral school has a reputation. It's run by a group called the Brethren of the Common Life, who had a reputation for being very good educators. And this is perhaps where Luther had the opportunity to make use of Scripture directly for the first time, because the Brethren of the Common Life oftentimes would have copies of portions of Scripture that the students could use. There is, however, a lot of mythology about Luther's school days. And one of the things that you oftentimes hear is that Luther was poor and he was just struggling to survive because he didn't have enough to eat and didn't have proper shelter and all of that. I think the reason that that legend has developed over time is because of a certain practice that students had. It was expected of students that they would maybe stand on the street corner and sing. And maybe they would shout out, Panem propter Deum, bread, for God's sake, bread. Now, perhaps some of the students were saying that because they actually needed a meal. But in Martin's case, his father is paying his way. He's not a starving student, but he does what's expected of students. He takes part in some of these things that students normally did. But Martin was not an abused child. He was not neglected. His father was providing for him very nicely. He's only going to spend 1 year there at Magdeburg, and then he's going to move on to another well-known, dare we call it prep school, at Eisenach. Remember, Eisenach is the town that his mother came from. So he would have had relatives there. That may have had something to do with it. But he's going to spend 3 years at the St. George's Parish School there in Eisenach. And Luther talks about this as being some of the happiest years of his life. The school is sort of on the forefront of education. There were people teaching at this school who are making use of some of the new learning principles that were around at this time. And going to be very, very helpful in preparing Martin for entrance into the university. So 8 years in Mansfeld, a year at Magdeburg, 3 years in Eisenach. Luther now is approaching his 18th birthday. He's not yet 18 when he is going to go to the university. When he's in Eisenach, he lives at the home of Kunz and Ursula Cotta. There may have been some sort of connection, although it's not an immediate family connection there. And Martin has a bit of a job. He's going to tutor a young boy in the Schalbe family. So he has room and board there in Eisenach. Now, how much his father contributed to that situation, we simply do not know. But all of this was preparation for entering university. And, of course, universities were more prevalent at this time. When you consider that the first university, a place that we might call a university, probably Bologna in the 11th century, by this time universities were more common, but still only a very small percentage of the population would go to these schools of higher learning. Luther's father is going to pick the school, just as Luther's father designated where he was going to go to his schools before university. So his father also is going to send him to the University at Erfurt. A school that had a very fine reputation, but maybe was a bit on the decline at this time, except for the area of the law. It had a very good reputation as far as producing lawyers go. And of course, that is what Hans Luther wanted from his son. He wanted a lawyer. We even have today the register book where the man who signed Luther in wrote, and he says, Martinus Luther. So there again, you don't have the spelling that we're familiar with today yet. Spelling was sort of optional at this time, and he's from Monsfeld. So the 17th of May, 1501, he is now at the university. In order to be a student at the university, you have to have a place to stay. And so Luther is going to be staying at something called a bursa, and sometimes a bursa is referred to as a frat house. Now, I would tend to shy away from that because frat houses today have a reputation that these places did not have. They were very strict set of rules that you had there. They were overseen by a member of the faculty who lived in the establishment. But in order to be at the university, you had to be a member of one of these dormitories. And he's going to probably be at St. George's Bursa there in Eisenach. So Eisleben is where he was born, Mansfeld is where he grew up, and now Erfurt is where he's going to be attending the university. At the center of town, still one of its most recognizable features are two big churches. On the left is the Cathedral of St. Mary, and on the right is the Church of St. Severinus. And both of those churches would have been there in use in 1501 when Luther got to town. So if Luther saw this picture today, he'd be able to identify those places because they would have been very, very familiar to him. Please.
Why were there two churches side by side?
Go to Watertown, Wisconsin, and you'll see St. Mark's and St. John's across the street from each other.
I mean, they didn't apply to parish.
See, the cathedral is for the entire diocese. So in a sense, it's for all the people in the diocese, whereas the Church of St. Severinus would be a parish church. Now, Erfurt is known as Little Rome because it has so many churches. It has not only these two churches, but it has 11 monastery churches and 20, I suppose if you count this one, 21 parish churches. So if you would have seen a picture of Erfurt at this time, all you would have seen would be steeples. There were a lot of churches in this particular town. And again, it doesn't necessarily say that they were more religious than other towns. It's just that they had the wealth in that town to provide for that. They had a special industry there that made a sort of a blue dye that was considered to be very expensive. And prosperity, you know, you maybe donate a little extra to build a church because you want to get into heaven, that kind of thing. Yeah. Luther entered the university May of 1501, and he's going to get his bachelor's degree in 1502, September 1502. So about 18 months after arriving, he has his bachelor's degree. Again, getting the degree, it has nothing to do with how long you've been there or how many courses you've taken. It has everything to do with demonstrating that you have learned something, that you have ability. And so usually what happens is the exams are oral. You are given a list of statements to defend. And you have to demonstrate that you know something. It's not a written test or anything like that that you'd be taking at this particular time. But let's face it, a bachelor's degree is worth nothing. It's not going to get you much of a job at this time. I'm not going to say that's true today, but at this time, you needed to go the next step. You needed a master's degree, if you were going to actually do something with that degree. And you notice January 1505, Luther is going to take his exams. He's going to defend himself publicly, and he's going to be granted a master's degree. This means that he could teach. It also means that he can go on to do graduate work. Both the bachelor's degree and the master's degree are in the liberal arts. The liberal arts were considered to be the essential thing that everybody needed to know. And if you wanted to do more, you would do it in 3 areas. You could do it in the law, you could do it in the area of medicine, or you could do it in the area of theology. Those were the only 3 graduate programs that would have been available, not only at Erfurt, but this would have been true of all of the universities in Europe at this particular time. And again, you had to have this foundation of the liberal arts. It's not like today where you enter the university and you immediately focus on your goal. That wasn't the case here. I've got a brother who's a dentist, and he made it all the way through without a history course. I, to this day, tell him he's an uneducated man because he has not had a history course. And I tell another brother who's a pharmacist, you also are uneducated because the only course he's ever had is the history of pharmacy. Now, come on. That doesn't really count. By the way, Luther thought very highly of history. I'll just slide that in there. Luther thought very highly of history. Luther graduates with his master's degree in January, but law school doesn't open until May. 19th of May, this is the festival of St. Ives. St. Ives is the patron saint of lawyers, and so the new class would enter law school on the 19th of May. So what is Luther doing from January until middle of May? He's doing some teaching. You see, when you graduate with a master's degree from the institution, you owe the school a couple of years of teaching. So Luther is teaching undergraduates, and he's spending a lot of time in the library where there is a Bible, and Luther is searching in the Bible. There's something that he's looking for, something that he has not discovered. And we want to keep that in mind, that there's a little bit of turmoil, not a little bit, a lot of turmoil going on in Luther's head. Anfechtung. If you've seen the Luther movie, you know that President Harrison from the Missouri Synod has just a really neat way of saying that. Anfechtung. This is a testing, this is a trial, a spiritual trial. And Luther is using the term, in fact, he probably coined the term to describe what's going on inside of him. He has this uncertainty. He does not know where he stands as far as God is concerned, and it's sort of ripping him apart. If he would die, what would God do with him? He doesn't have the answer to that. And that is causing him some discomfort, to put it mildly. Now, maybe that discomfort is being fueled by the possibility that death could come very, very quickly. You know, medical science at this time was rather rudimentary. You had an appendicitis, the chances were good that you would die because they didn't know how to operate on you. If you got a fever, it was considered to be a very serious thing because you didn't go down to Walgreens and get something for it. Luther, again, is concerned about his relationship with God and what would happen if he would die. 1502, Luther has a serious fever. And, Luther survives the fever, obviously. But again, that uncertainty is gripping him. What would have happened if he had not survived? Easter break. We don't know if it's 1503 or 1504, but Luther had gone home for the Easter break, and now he's coming back to the university. I'm not going to suggest to you that Luther was a klutz, but he was carrying this rather large knife, and he succeeded in cutting himself in the thigh with his own knife as he's walking along, cutting an artery. Blood all over the place. Luther thought for sure he was going to die. He put pressure on the wound while his traveling companion ran into the nearest town to get a physician. What he came back with was a barber. Barbers, of course, did many things besides cutting hair. They pulled teeth. They did some things that we would normally consider the area of a doctor. They got the bleeding stopped during the night. That wound broke open again. The bleeding started again. Luther could have very easily died at that time. Again, more uncertainty. What would happen to me if I had died? 1505, the plague, the Black Death, comes to Erfurt. And one of Luther's fellow students, somebody who had been rather close to Luther, perhaps had even participated in his master's debate, Hieronymus Wundt. If you don't like Hieronymus, that's just the fancy Latin word for Jerome. He dies of the plague. And again, Luther's thinking, what's going to happen to me if I should die? As I said, from January of 1505 until May of 1505, Luther had the opportunity to spend some serious time reading in the Bible. He doesn't have one of his own. He's got to go to the library to do that. And he's looking for answers. And he's not finding answers there that would calm down this troubled conscience. Luther has a very tender conscience, a conscience that is easily troubled by questions like, if I should die, what would happen to me? And now we get to see if I can handle the technology here, which is a really iffy thing. Worked before, famous last words. And this really neat vignette, from the Luther movie. It's a little blurb of where Luther is going to be dealing with difficulty. But that's technology. Luther, of course, is going to be having that challenge with the lightning strike. What's Luther doing going home in June, the end of June, when law school just started in May? That's rather unusual. Normally we would not think of 6 weeks after the start of the school year there's a long vacation. There are, I think, two possibilities as to why Luther went home. Perhaps his father had summoned him to come home. And we do know that one of the things that Luther's father was doing was he was looking for a wife for Martin. Of course, young men cannot do that for themselves. They need parental help. in finding a wife. And Luther's father might have called Martin home to look over some of the candidates that he had been gathering together. Or, and maybe this is my personal preference, Martin is coming home to talk to his father about the law. You see, the law is not really grabbing him. The law doesn't seem, it seems so trivial. He wants to do something worthwhile with his life, but he doesn't know what that is, of course. And again, if you've seen the Luther movie, there's a bit of a fracture there with his father because Martin doesn't know what he wants to do. He's not so certain about the law thing. And it's on the way back to Erfurt. He's only a couple of miles outside of Erfurt, the little village of Stotternheim, when he gets caught in a thunderstorm. There's a lightning strike nearby, throwing him to the ground. With his already troubled conscience, this is sort of like the straw that breaks the camel's back. St. Anne, help me, I will become a monk. It's not a spur of the moment thing. It's been something Luther has been rolling over in his mind for some time already, and this just forces him now to make some sort of decision. St. Anne, of course, Luther had been taught that as the patron saint of minors, that you would call upon her. St. Anne is the mother of the Virgin Mary. How do we know that? Because the Catholic Church tells us so. It's not in Scripture. Luther's friends try to talk him out of this. You know, you were scared out of your wits, you didn't know what you were saying. There's really no need for you to follow through on this particular thing, they told him. But remember Martin's tender conscience. He believes that he has made a vow that he must in fact carry out. 2 weeks, yes?
Some years ago, we were at the Wartburg, and in reading the signs that go by, and of course we read them very hardly, it says that Luther was with a traveling companion by the name of Alexis, who was killed by this lightning bolt. Now, is that fiction or is that
Legend. Luther never mentions who he was with or anything other than the fact that he had this experience himself. I wish that he had kept a better diary, because there are many other questions that I have for him that are basically left unanswered. The other thing that he needed to do in that diary was also date things, because there are a few things we know happened, but we don't know exactly when they happened. And inquiring minds want to know, of course. 2 weeks after the experience, he gathers his friends together, gives away most of his possessions. By the way, he keeps a few Latin books, because, you know, even in the monastery, a few Latin books would do you well. And now, he fully expected that when his friends led him to the gate of the monastery, that this would be the last he would see of the outside world. Luther had no clue as to what the Lord had in store for him. In Erfurt, you have virtually every monastic order that you can think of. Why does Luther choose the Augustinian eremites, the Augustinian hermits? Because this was considered to be the strictest of the strict. He did not want a monastery that was like a country club. He wanted a monastery that would be very firm with him, that would force him to go through a whole set of rules and regulations. And that was the reputation of the Augustinian eremites. But Luther was also somewhat familiar with the Augustinians, because his bursa, his dormitory, was in relative close proximity to this monastery. And at the university, some of his classmates had been Augustinians, and some of his teachers had been Augustinians. So it was not an unknown quantity when he goes to this particular monastery. You notice that the monastery is a relatively old one. At the time that Luther enters, it was considered to be a large, flourishing monastery. It had approximately 50 monks in it, and that was considered to be quite well-to-do monastery. That, by the way, is another Lucas Cranach pencil drawing of Luther as a monk. You notice he has the nifty haircut, the tonsure. The tonsure, of course, is to represent the crown of thorns. You also notice that this is not the Luther of later life. Luther, after he marries Kate, begins to fill out a little bit. His physique matures a little bit. At this time, he's pretty scrawny. Luther says, if anyone would have gained heaven as a monk, then I would have indeed been among them. He did everything required and much, much more than what was required of the monks. Because, you see, that's why he's in the monastery. He's in the monastery to get right with God. He's in the monastery to earn God's favor so that he doesn't have to have this fear of what's going to happen to him at some later date. Now, you don't just enter the monastery. There is a period of what I would call probation. That's what the novitiate is. For 1 year, you would be examined by the other monks to see if you were fit for monastic life. And you also had the opportunity to see what monastic life was like, and you could pull out. There were no guarantees that you would stay there in the monastery. It's after he had been there for 1 year that Luther will be taking his vows, his permanent vows, poverty, chastity, and obedience. And now, of course, when he takes those vows, technically speaking, he's not supposed to pull out anymore. He takes his final vows on the grave of this Johannes Zacharias, who was one of the prosecutors at the trial of Jan Hus. He was an Augustinian hero because he had prosecuted that heretic Jan Hus. And so if you can imagine spending the night spread-eagled, face down over the grave, I don't know if they were trying to pick up good vibrations from this hero, but that's how Luther spent his night there in the chapel of the monastery before he took his final vows. He had been told that when you became a monk, it was like being baptized again. That all of your sins were wiped away. It was a clean slate. The only problem was Luther wasn't feeling it. He wasn't feeling as if he was right with God. He uses terms like in cloaca. We probably today would say he was down in the dumps, but literally it means in the sewer. That's where his feelings were. Tentatio tristitiae, this idea of despair, sadness, heavy, weighing him down, and then that anfechtung again. Those are the terms that Luther uses to describe his mental state. Even after he becomes a monk, it's not doing for him what he thought it would do. It's not bringing him closer to God like he wanted to be. His mentor, Johann von Staupitz, tells him, don't you believe in the forgiveness of God? You know, Staupitz recognizes that this is a troubled soul. He goes to confession. regularly, more than regularly, not for a few minutes, but for hours. And the interesting thing is Staupitz doesn't kick him out as some sort of mental case. Staupitz recognizes that this guy has a real lot of potential. We just have to harness it. We have to keep him busy, because if Luther has too much time to think, he's going to get himself into difficulty. And so Staupitz is going to come up with a program that Luther has to follow. Now, when Luther joined the monastery, he had no desire to be a priest. But now that he's a full-fledged monk, Staupitz says, "You will become a priest." Remember, he had taken a vow of obedience. So he cannot get out of this. Staupitz says, "You do this," and he is going to be forced to do this. So he's ordained a year later. Unlike today, where seminary is a 4-year program, things have moved along a little more rapidly at this time. So he's going to celebrate his first Mass a month later, his first service. And it's a month later because he wants to invite some friends and relatives. His father comes to town with a group of 20 horsemen, which shows you that his father's a rather important individual. His father's going to give a substantial gift to the monastery. Not because his father is so pleased with what his son has done, but because it was expected that you would give a gift. And at the banquet, which his father threw for his son, Luther turns to his father and says, "Father, you should be very pleased. I can do a whole lot more for you and Mom for eternity here in the monastery than I could have been being a lawyer." And his father is not persuaded. Luther says that this is something God wanted him to do. His father responds by telling him, "Well, Satan can also whisper in your ear." So his father's not pleased with him at this stage of the meeting. Luther thought he was done. He's a priest. Staupitz knows you got to keep him busy, so now he's got to study to become a doctor of theology. Luther is not happy. "It will be the death of me." And Staupitz responds, "Quite all right. God has plenty of work for clever men like you to do in heaven." So there is really no empathy or sympathy for him from Staupitz. It's while he's going through this program that he's going to take a trip down to Rome. The Augustinian order had some internal conflict, and they were sending a petition down to the Pope. Luther is not the man carrying the petition. He's the traveling companion. Augustinians had the practice that you always traveled 2 by 2. You could not travel by yourself. Who knows what kind of trouble you could get into all by yourself? So you had to have a traveling companion. And Luther went down there as the traveling companion. Staupitz thought that this was going to be a great experience for Luther, that he'd see the holy city with all of its grandeur, and that his mind would be resting now, that everything between him and God was fine. Luther says, "I would not have missed seeing Rome for 100,000 florins, for then I might have been afraid of being unfair to the Pope." He was appalled by what he saw there. The drinking, the prostitution, the lack of loyalty on the part of the priests. Luther goes on to say, "I would not exchange for money my trip to Rome, otherwise I would not have believed what I saw with my own eyes. Godlessness and evil are great and shameless there. Neither God nor man, neither sin nor modesty are respected. So testify all the pious who were there and all the godless who returned worse from Italy."
Who was the Pope at that time?
Julius II.
Was he a Medici?
No, that would be either Alexander VI, who came before, no, excuse me, Leo X. Alexander VI is a Borgia, which is even worse. It would be Leo X or Clement VII. Those are the two Medici popes. And that will be right after Julius. Julius II is known as the warrior pope. He spent more time on the battlefield than he did in church or in Rome. Remember the old black and white Luther movie?
Yeah.
And Luther's in Rome, and the Pope rides by on a horse in armor. Wrong. Julius was out of town when Luther was there. That was one of those liberties that filmmakers take. But yeah, when Julius II dies, he is succeeded by Leo X, who is a Medici. And he, of course, is the one that is going to be involved with the 95 Theses. So, Mansfeld, where Luther grew up, now Luther is going to Wittenberg. The reason that Staupitz wanted Luther to get a doctorate in theology is because Staupitz, as the head of all the Augustinians in Germany, had more work than he could handle. Staupitz had been one of the founding fathers of the new university at Wittenberg. The university opened in 1502. It was a brand new university. And Staupitz now has Luther prepared to take his place there at Wittenberg. Again, you've got a couple of churches in town. You've got the Electors Church, the so-called Castle Church. All Saints is its actual name. And this is where Luther will be buried ultimately, but he rarely preached there. That's not the place where he would normally be found. But this is the town church, St. Mary's Church. This is the church where Luther is going to be a regular pulpit assistant. In 1514, the priest at St. Mary's had a throat ailment and had to do some R&R. And so Luther is going to temporarily take over the pulpit there. He will preach on a regular basis there from 1514 until his death in 1546. It's one of those things, once you start something, how do you get out of it? But again, you see the hand of the Lord, because Luther is going to be dealing with real people on a regular basis. Luther's not going to be just in his ivory tower there at the university. He's going to be hearing confession. He's going to be preaching on a regular basis to these people. So he knows what's on their mind. He knows what their concerns are. And of course, the Black Cloister there in Wittenberg, this will be the home of Luther. And when Luther gets married, the elector is going to give him this place as his parsonage. It looks sort of white, but it's called the Black Cloister because of the garb that the monks wore. The monks wore a black habit, a black outfit. And it gets the name from the color of the monks' clothes, not from the color of the cloister itself. When does Luther get away from this notion that he has to somehow earn God's favor? Again, I wish Luther had kept a more careful record, because we do not know the exact date. Some suggest it was as early as 1514. Others say, oh no, it was later. Personally, I think it's earlier rather than later, because he's going to be teaching Paul's letter to the Romans. And it's Romans chapter 1, verse 17. The just shall live by faith, that becomes the determining factor. Luther, however, does tell us what was going on. Doesn't tell us when, but he does tell us what was going on. Though I lived as a monk without reproach, I felt I was a sinner before God with an extremely disturbed conscience. I could not believe that he was placated, that he was pleased by my satisfaction. I did not love, yes, I hated the righteous God who punishes sinners, and secretly, if not blasphemingly, certainly murmuring greatly, I was angry with God. that God was demanding too much of him. I hated the righteous God. At last, by the mercy of God, meditating day and night, I gave heed to the context of the words, namely, in it the righteousness of God is revealed, as it is written, he who through faith is righteous shall live, Romans 1, verse 17. There I began to understand that the righteousness of God is not that by which the righteous lives, but a gift of God, namely by faith. Here I felt that I was altogether born again and had entered paradise itself through open gates. Again, this is not original with Luther. There were others. But again, Luther's going to be able to get this information out in a way that people previously had been unable to do. The Bible is, once again, Luther is going to look at the Bible as all centered on Jesus Christ. Not a self-help book, but something that tells us about what Christ has done for us. And having experienced that lifting of the burden that he had felt for so long, he just had to tell others. It was not something that he could keep to himself. And here's where that whole indulgence thing comes in. The idea that you could buy a piece of paper, that would make it right between you and God. That was not something that Luther was able ultimately to defend. Now, in 1517, when Luther writes the 95 Theses, he's not eliminating indulgences. He is attacking the abuse of indulgences, because he thought guys like Tetzel were giving the people a false sense of security, a sense of security in what they were doing and ignoring what God had done for them. Indulgences, supposedly, this is God drawing, or the Pope drawing from the storehouse of extra good deeds that others have done. And indulgences start at the time of the Crusades, and they keep growing and growing and growing until you can finally get your grandmother out of purgatory. The indulgence that Luther is especially concerned about is one that this man, Albrecht the Hohenzollern, had made a deal with the Pope on. He purchased a number of positions, and he was in debt. The Pope is the guy getting all the money from these positions, and so the Pope is going to make a special indulgence that only this man could sell. And it was the indulgence then that Luther is going to be attacking. And of course, there were many salesmen of this indulgence, but the one that is famous is the one that Luther knows about, John Tetzel, who has his own little slogan. You know, everybody has to have a slogan. If you're selling cars or if you're a lawyer, you have to have a slogan, and that was his slogan. And people thought that they could get right with God simply by buying a piece of paper. And Luther, in the 95 Theses, we're celebrating the 500th anniversary of the posting of the 95 Theses. I think Luther might be a bit surprised by that, because you see, this is Luther in his infancy. He's attacking the abuses of indulgences. He's not yet throwing indulgences out the window. He still believes in purgatory. He still believes that the Pope is innocent in this whole thing, that the Pope has no idea what's going on. You read the 95 Theses and you say, whoa, Luther sounds pretty Catholic. And of course, he was Catholic at this particular time. But it does show you something about the progress that he's making. More and more, he's going back to Scripture. Scripture is becoming the primary concern for Luther. And as time goes on, there are many things in this 95 Theses that Luther will also be going away from. So this year we're celebrating the beginning of the Reformation. The beginning, not the full-blown Reformation. If they had asked me, which of course they didn't, I would have said, let's hold off until 1520 and celebrate the 500th anniversary of 1520. But so be it. We can celebrate the beginning of the Reformation. People began to question the value of indulgences. The receipts went nosediving down, and that really got the attention of people. Luther complaining about the abuses probably would not have gotten much attention, but when the sale of indulgences drops off dramatically, that gets their attention. Luther sinned in two respects, Erasmus says. He attacked the crown of the Pope and the bellies of the monks. Of course, the monks were selling the indulgence. They were getting a cut out of selling the indulgences. Luther really wasn't attacking the authority of the Pope, however. I think Luther was a bit naive because he did not recognize that what he was doing was really questioning the authority of the papacy, because the papacy was the one that had issued the indulgence in the first place. It spreads rapidly. It's amazing how fast the news about the 95 Theses spread. Luther did not have it published. It was written in Latin. It was intended for an academic debate, but very quickly was translated into German and spread like wildfire. And again, the advances, the technological advances made that possible. Friedrich Myconius, a Lutheran pastor, the first Lutheran historian of the Reformation, says it was as though the angels themselves were the messengers carrying the news to all peoples. John X says it's heresy. He calls him a Bohemian, which is, of course, a reference to Jan Hus, that Luther was guilty of heresy here. And Albrecht is going to send the 95 Theses to Pope Leo. Pope Leo doesn't know a whole lot about theology, to be honest. But he does know that his treasury is not getting as much money as he had hoped. And so something has to be done. One of the theologians in Rome says that Luther has to be wrong, because the Pope is always right. The Pope, like the Church, is infallible. And this is even before 1870. This is even before Vatican I, when papal infallibility became a teaching of the Church. The strange thing is that none of the responses actually dealt with the 95 Theses and the abuse of indulgences. Everybody is attacking Luther because they think he is attacking the Pope, that he dares to question the Pope's authority to grant this special indulgence in the first place. It's only as time goes along that Luther is going to recognize the Pope's part in this whole problem. Luther's willing to give him the benefit of the doubt in 1517. You don't know what's going on. You don't know what people are doing in your name. So, 1517, the 95 Theses, remember it as the beginning of the Reformation. And stay tuned, because we have 30 years now. So for the next 30 years, we ought to be celebrating 500th anniversaries of things that were taking place in the Reformation. But most people, when they read the 95 Theses, say, This is the Reformation. You know, this is the very beginning of the Reformation. It's been a very gentle audience, asking me challenging questions of sorts. We have only a couple of minutes before they're going to start turning out the lights there, and we may get locked in. But are there any questions that you have, not necessarily limited to what we've gone through with the time of Luther up to and including the posting of the 95 Theses?
I remember when we were there that Luther also was appointed as, what do I want to say, not a supervisor, but a person who went around to the various...
District vicar.
Okay.
District vicar of the Augustinian order. Shortly after he got to Wittenberg, he got a number of extra jobs. He was appointed by Staupitz as the preacher in the chapel there of the Augustinian. And every 3 years, the Augustinians had a conference of the Augustinians. And Luther was elected as a district vicar. He had at first 10 and then a little bit later 11 monasteries that he had to visit and make certain that they were doing things the way they were supposed to be doing it. That's taking Luther's time because he has to travel to these monasteries. Now, they're all in electoral Saxony, but still, he doesn't have a horse, he doesn't have a car, he's got to walk. And one of the things that happens is he gets behind. I know that none of us ever get behind, but Luther got behind on his prayers. Monks had daily prayers that they were supposed to offer. And he would have to lock himself in his room on Saturday and catch up on all the prayers that he'd gotten behind on during the course of the week. Also, it's not an exaggeration when they say Luther oftentimes preached 160 times in the course of a year. That's a lot. I don't care how you cut it, that's a lot. And he's teaching, and he has responsibilities in the Augustinian order. He's busy. He's a busy guy. Please.
How did the Luther sites fare during World War II?
The Augustinian monastery in Erfurt was hit by a bomb, which was unfortunate because there were a whole group of people that were sheltered in the basement during the air raid. And so Erfurt had a few sites that were eliminated. The Wartburg was not hurt there. Eisleben, Mansfeld, those were little itty-bitty places. You wouldn't bother with them. Wittenberg, I'm not aware of that being attacked during the war either. At least nothing was ever mentioned about damage. But the Augustinian monastery in Erfurt was damaged. So you go to those places. By the way, maybe wait until after this year because they are really packed this year. I was there in 2015. They were talking already at that time about how 2017 was virtually sold out. So if you didn't have your place early on, you probably wouldn't have to tent your way through land. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the anniversary year. And remember to stop.